Welcome everyone. On behalf of the Litfest board, we are incredibly pleased you have joined us for this, our 42nd Lancaster Literature Festival. At Litfest, we're committed to delivering a varied programme of events across multiple strands of the book and storytelling worlds. After a successful opening weekend, Litfest 2020 had to be cancelled due to COVID-19. So for this year's festival, the board has been creative in developing a programme of events which are diverse, inclusive, and which are all able to be delivered online. Thanks to support from Lancaster City Council and the Arts Council England, we've been able to put this year's online festival on with a variety of free events for all tastes and interests, running activity to encourage more people of all ages to read, create and share stories in Lancaster and beyond. But we do need your help. We want to be able to run high quality events and projects all year round, running more initiatives to connect with audiences and provide paid opportunities for writers, illustrators, storytellers and other artists, many of whom have faced unprecedented challenges during the past year. So to do this, we rely on donations from you, our audience. So once you've enjoyed this event, please consider donating via our website. Anything you can afford to give will be very much appreciated. This year's events are all online and free to access, but with your support and donations, we can look forward to developing even more ambitious programmes in future years. So your donations, big or small, will play a part in the festival's future. Our thanks to Arts Council England, Lancaster City Council, and the National Lottery for funding streams which have enabled us to achieve such a varied programme of events this year. Thank you for joining us. Sit back and from the comfort of your own home, please enjoy. So, after a year when so many people have been isolated from friends, from colleagues and families, we really wanted to create an opportunity for stories and reading to unite people and bring them together. When we read, we connect with different worlds, different times and different ways of seeing and understanding our lives and those of other people. There's something amazing in how the same book can provoke such different responses and reactions depending upon who has read it and the time when they encountered it. As readers, many of us will have experienced that moment where we reach the end of the book and feel a palpable pang of loss or sorrow to be leaving behind the characters we love and the worlds that they inhabit. During reading, many of us will have longed to stop what we're doing and get back to the book, eager to immerse ourselves and find out what happens next. Authors, poets, illustrators and storytellers might create the stories we love, but it is in the hearts and minds of readers where they live. And the Litfest Big Read is intended to be a celebration of all of this. We've chosen two fantastic books, both of which have been incredibly highly praised and which offer amazing journeys for readers. And we're challenging you to read these and also to help us by spreading the word. Let's really get everyone reading, families, colleagues, friends and reading groups, and celebrate what reading is and can be. Bookshops and libraries are stocking these books, and we have competitions running to win a free pass to 3 Litfest events over the next 12 months, as well as your choice of 3 paperback books. So please do join in with us. And of course, one of the books we are recommending for the Litfest Big Read is Matt Haig's incredible The Midnight Library. It explores Nora's life and the choices and decisions that she has made. At the stroke of midnight on her last day on Earth, Nora finds herself transported to a library where she's given the chance to undo her regrets and try out the multiple lives she might have lived had her choices been different. Poignant and incredibly powerful, The Midnight Library is a story about regrets, hopes, second chances, and accepting and appreciating the lives that we have. We are delighted to welcome best-selling author Matt Haig to Litfest. Matt, a very big welcome and thank you for agreeing to be part of the first Litfest Big Read. The protagonist of The Midnight Library, Nora, is at a really challenging point in her life. I wonder whether you're able to introduce us to her and tell us a little about the concept of her root life.
Yeah, okay. Well, Nora is a 35-year-old woman and she's been having a difficult time. She feels very stuck. I suppose we've all had that feeling this year, but she feels very stuck in her life. She's just recently lost a job. She's had relationship woes and regrets. She's still grieving her parents and feels a lot of guilt that she hasn't become the person her parents wanted her to be. Her pet died. She has a whole sort of like smorgasbord of problems, and she's going through situational depression. That's what the doctors called it for her. And she's at a dead end in life, and she's suicidal, and she does something stupid and takes her life into her own hands. And between life and death, she finds herself in the Midnight Library, where shelves go on forever, infinite, surreal library, where she's told by librarian Mrs. Elm that every single book on the shelf is a different version of her life. If she had made different decisions somewhere along the line, or if she, if something different had happened. And to enter those lives, she has to open the book. So that's basically the premise of and she's got to work out, is there a life worth living for her? Is the grass greener? All of those sort of vaguely existential things.
Brilliant, thank you. And I wonder whether we could ask you, please, whether you'd be willing to give us a reading to provide us with a bit of a flavour of the book, please.
Yes. I noticed some people are having a bit of a problem with the sound. Is that my sound? Or I don't know. But anyway, I'll read. Okay. Right. I will read from the very first chapter, not the very first chapter, but the very first chapter where we're in the Midnight Library. Okay. As she spoke, Mrs. Elm's eyes came alive, twinkling like puddles in moonlight. Between life and death, there is a library, she said. And within that library, the shelves go on forever. Every book provides a chance to try another life you could have lived, to see how things would be different if you'd made other choices. Would you have done anything different if you had the chance to undo your regrets? So I am dead, Nora asked. Mrs. Elm shook her head. No, listen carefully. Between life and death. She gestured vaguely along the aisle towards the distance. Death is outside. Well, I should go there, because I want to die. Nora began walking. But Mrs. Elm shook her head. That isn't how death works. Why not? You don't go to death. Death comes to you. Even death was something Nora couldn't do properly, it seemed. It was a familiar feeling, this feeling of being incomplete in just about every sense, an unfinished jigsaw of a human, incomplete living and incomplete dying. So why am I not dead? Why has death not come to me? I gave it an open invitation. I'd wanted to die, but here I am still existing. I'm still aware of things. Well, if it's any comfort, you are very possibly about to die. People who pass by the library usually don't stay long one way or the other. And when she thought about it, increasingly she had been thinking about it, Nora was only able to think to herself in terms of the things she wasn't, the things she hadn't been able to become. And there really were quite a lot of things she hadn't become. The regrets which were on permanent repeat in her mind. I haven't become an Olympic swimmer. I haven't become a glaciologist. I haven't become Dan's wife. I haven't become a mother. I haven't become the lead singer of The Labyrinths. I haven't managed to become a truly good or truly happy person. And now, last of all, she hadn't even managed to become dead. It was pathetic, really, the amount of possibilities she had squandered. While the Midnight Library stands, Nora, you will be preserved from death. Now you have to decide how you want to live. Okay, so it sounds a bit better now, I think. Yes.
Yes. Brilliant, thank you. I think it was something to do with my microphone, so I'll mute between questions. Thank you, a real treat to hear you reading there. The world building throughout the book is incredibly strong, with the idea of Nora's sort of root life and the different books and opportunities that she could take. I wonder how you set about sort of constructing the rules for the world, and whether there are any particular influences for its creation.
Yes, but there are lots and lots of influences. I mean, I wanted to write about parallel lives for a long time. Like years ago, I wrote a novel called The Humans, which was a very strange novel about an alien coming to Earth. And yeah, since that time, I've had this idea of doing a parallel life novel, and I didn't have any inkling of how to do it. And obviously there are great parallel life stories out there, and there are a lot of parallel life movies out there, and I didn't really have anything new to add into the mix until I had the concept of the Midnight Library itself, of the library. And I was inspired. There's a short story by I've got to speak Spanish now, Jorge Luis Borges, who wrote the Library of Babel, which is a story. It's not about parallel lives, but it's a story about an infinite library. And it's kind of a nightmarish story, but it's about, a library that's sort of infinite, and where there's every single book that in existence on the shelves. And I thought, or every possible book. And I thought, how about sort of turning that kind of infinite library into a portal? Because I think in a way, I love libraries. And I think in a way, libraries are the closest we get to parallel universes, because we are in a library, and we are surrounded by other worlds and other access. And I'll have a quick, it's not particularly near Lancaster, but I grew up in Nottinghamshire and Newark-on-Trent, and I used to go to the library in Newark-on-Trent. So I just want to give a little big up to Newark-on-Trent Library, which is still going strong despite budget cuts and all those things. Anyway, and there's that influence, and there was also the movie It's a Wonderful Life, which was a very big influence, which I reference. If you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, you'll notice a few subtle or not so subtle references. The fact that it's set in Bedford is because of It's a Wonderful Life, because that's Bedford Falls. What else is there? In the career where she's a musician, one of the albums called Pottersville, which is a reference to It's a Wonderful Life. So it's all that. In terms of the mechanics, now I've written sort of science fiction-y books before, and I know that you can get absolutely bogged down as a writer if you worry too much about trying to make your fantasy make complete logical sense, because then you can get bogged down in explaining every detail, and readers start losing the emotion of the story, or they start caring, basically, because it becomes boring. So I did try and sort of like explain the mechanics of it a little bit. There's a character in the book called Hugo, who she meets in one of her lives, where she's a glaciologist in the Arctic Circle, and he kind of explains it using quantum physics, and it goes a bit Doctor Who for a while, or if you ever saw the old TV show Quantum Leap, it goes a bit into that territory. But I very much didn't want, I wanted it to make sense within the book, but I didn't want it to have to absolutely, for every reader to understand every logistical detail of it. And also with science fiction, you can often get into a bit of a pickle when you start explaining too much, because then you'll notice some inconsistencies and that stuff. So I kept the focus on the emotion and the story, but I did have to think a bit about the mechanics. The main thing to know is that each time she gets disappointed with her life, she finds herself back in the library. And she can't do this an infinite number of times, even though there's an infinite number of lives, because she's between life and death, and the library itself is very fragile, and the lights start flickering and books start falling off shelves. And so she has to there's some time pressure on her to actually find the perfect life for herself, basically.
Brilliant, thank you. Really fascinating to hear about all of those influences and detail, and I think you do discover and notice more on each rereading of the book. I've read it several times now. There's a lovely quote: "Philosophy seemed to be the only subject that matched her sudden inward intensity." And there is something very reflective about philosophy, and it's notable just how much is woven throughout the book. Is philosophy a particular interest of yours?
Yes, it is. I mean, it was definitely, I never thought it was really when I was younger, but I think so. I think my own experience of mental health issues, which I wrote about in a book called Reasons to Stay Alive, shaped that a lot, because basically when you go through an experience like depression, as I'm sure a lot of people watching this will know, you end up trapped in your own mind quite a lot. And, you know, I was diagnosed with panic disorder and depression. And I used to get very bad panic attacks, and I was suicidal for a while, not unlike Nora in the book, at the start of the book. And I think there's a very strong link between philosophy and therapy, certainly ancient philosophy. In fact, you know, the most common form of therapy prescribed on the NHS when you go to a talk therapist is cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. And CBT itself, the founders of CBT, whose names I've forgotten, but these doctors who founded CBT, they were inspired by an ancient Greek philosopher, just remembering his name, Epictetus. And there was one particular quote of Epictetus, which, and I will paraphrase it, as I don't know the ancient Greek, but he said something like, it's not about the things that happen in your life, it's about your response to the things that happen in your life. And that, I suppose, is the core of therapy. It's about, you can't necessarily change the world, but you can change your reaction to the world. You can't change horrible things happening. You can't change a pandemic, or you can't change all the messy stuff of human life, but you can work on how you respond to things, which is a sort of classic therapy technique. And that goes all the way back, you know, over 2,000 years to ancient Greece. And it's the ancient sort of philosophy I like. It's like looking at stuff that was written or said 2 millennia ago, which still holds up, you know, that proper sort of human truth. There's a more recent philosopher who I draw on a lot in the Midnight Library, though. That's Henry David Thoreau, who was an American philosopher in the 1800s. And he's just like a fascinating guy, because he was a great writer anyway, and he was very much into nature. And he's a great lockdown read himself, if you read his diaries, because he wanted to sort of just disappear and go into the woods. And he did so. He went and built his own log cabin. This is in Massachusetts in America. And he built his log cabin and went to live there on his own with no human company for two years, a bit like Tom Hanks in Castaway, but he actually wanted to do it. And, you know, he fished, he chopped down trees, he observed nature, and he wrote a lot of philosophy there as well. And I just find him so interesting, because I can remember when I was a teenager, sorry, this is a bit of a long answer, but when I was a teenager, I had a birthday present, which was a book of quotations. And there was a quote from Henry David Thoreau, and I'd never heard of him, but he was just a name. And the quote was something about, my aim in life is to suck all the marrow out of life. And I thought, yes, that's what I want to do. And in my head, I thought that meant, you know, go to Ibiza, go to party all night, drink it all hours of the day, have a crazy wild time, listen to loud music. And what he meant, I realized years later, was he meant retreat into nature and, you know, observe the birds and observe the trees and actually feel truly alive. And I think that's a sentiment I suppose a lot of us relate to in this era, because you know, there hasn't been so much of life available to us, but we've been, you know, well, a lot of us have been going on like nature walks and things like that. And during lockdown, I've been doing a lot of that and actually feeling more alive because of it, for being closer to nature. So he's a great philosopher on nature, and he features a lot in the Midnight Library. Yes. Sorry. Very long answer. Sorry, Jake.
No, please don't apologise. A really fascinating
And I'm
answer.
loving all these comments on the side. Hi, Valerie, Heather, Chris, Andy, Steve, Lisa. Yeah, yeah. I'm sort of listening to Jake and reading your comments.
Brilliant. Yeah, really interesting to hear what you were saying about CBT and the kind of different way of looking, and acceptance is very important in this novel. I'm going to do another quote for you from your book. Sorry, I do apologise, but it's okay. Eminently quotable. So, she imagined what it would be like to accept herself completely. Every mistake she had ever made, every mark on her body, every dream she hadn't reached or pain she had felt, every lust or longing she had suppressed. She imagined accepting it all, the way she accepted nature, the way she accepted a glacier or a puffin or the breach of a hole. She imagined seeing herself as just another brilliant freak of nature, just another sentient animal trying their best. And in doing so, she imagined what it would be like to be free. And I wonder, do you feel self-acceptance leads to a type of freedom?
Yes, and I think it's increasingly hard to find it in the modern age. I almost feel like 21st century society, even pre-pandemic, is kind of trying to steer us away from self-acceptance. You know, like sometimes my non-fiction books are called self-help books, and I struggle with that as a title because I think self-help is often about self-improvement, and there's a lot of emphasis on self-improvement. But I think, you know, there should be more emphasis in a way on self-acceptance, because I think self-improvement can sometimes make you feel even worse, because you feel like, well, I've got to, you know, I can't be happy with where I am. I've got to get to somewhere else. And obviously we need to improve ourselves and we need to work towards things and strive for things. And that's human nature and that's good. But I think there can be an overemphasis on trying to make you feel like you lack something. And I think part of that is because we live in a very commercial sort of capitalist age where for the economy to keep functioning, they don't want you to be happy with what you've got, because if you're happy with what you've got, then you're not buying new stuff, which is the solution to, you know, whatever lack they want you to feel. So whether it's, I don't know, like an anti-aging moisturizer, whether it's insurance, whatever, they're trying to sort of, we're constantly being told we need something to be secure, or we need something else, because most of us, fortunately, in the sort of Western world, most of us have the absolute basics. Most of us are lucky enough, not everyone, of course, but most of us are lucky enough to have a roof over our head and to access food and water. So we've got shelter and we've got like sort of cave person basics. And so yet we've still got the same human brains who feel stress and worry and anxiety. And those emotions are increasingly sort of manipulated by advertisers, by social media. And self-acceptance is just becoming harder. It's becoming harder to do. I mean, you go on social media, you go on Facebook or Instagram, and you see hundreds of people that you would not have seen in the pre-technological age. These aren't people who would have been living in your same village necessarily. These are, you know, sometimes super famous people or super talented people or conventionally beautiful people or people with like a bazillion followers. And you can end up feeling a kind of lack. And I feel like self-acceptance is so important because of that, almost as a counterbalance. And I wrote the Midnight Library really as a kind of self-therapy for me, to try and accept that, because I've noticed in my working life, like I have, you know, been quite a workaholic at times. I've been overly ambitious at times. And as I get older, I realize that there's no end point to that. Once you start playing that game, you know, you can have, like, I can remember before I was published saying, my only dream in terms of work is to have a book that's published. And then you get the book that's published, and then suddenly your brain adjusts and you get used to being a published author. So you want the next thing. You want a best-selling book, or you want a movie deal, or you want to be #1 bestseller, whatever, or you want a foreign deal. You know, there's always another goalpost ahead of you. I can remember there's a quote, I think it's not from a philosopher, it's from Jim Carrey, you know, the actor. And he said that it was a joke about him going to bed thinking about his 2 Golden Globes that he's won, and realizing that he'd only be happy if he had 3 Golden Globes as house. There's always a next level. There's always a goalpost. Wherever you are in life, there's always something else as soon as you play that game. And the thing is, I often think, this is going to sound so corny and sentimental, but if you think about a newborn baby, no one looks at a newborn baby. No one looks at you as a baby or a newborn baby and sees a lack, or sees that like they are somehow less. You know, we see infinite human worth when you see a newborn baby. But increasingly, as we go through life and through the education system and the world of grades and incomes and all those numerical measurements, we've got more reasons to doubt ourselves or think we should be in the perfect relationship like that person we saw on Facebook, or we should be you know, in the perfect job or living in the perfect place. And we lose that, what we once had, what we once were born with, increasingly. So I think anything we can do towards self-acceptance in this day and age is of value, yes, basically.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, what you were saying about shifting goalposts really resonates with me. And I suppose it also sort of ties in with my next question, which is around libraries. And libraries for me have always offered an escape and a sanctuary, and are sort of removed from the idea of commercialism and ambition. And the Litfest Big Read is being supported by Lancashire County Council's library service. And of course, libraries are incredibly important to this book. I just wonder what libraries and librarians have meant to you.
Okay, well, yeah, I grew up in a small town, Newark-on-Trent. It's on the train line between London and Edinburgh. Most people just get the train straight through it. Population, 30,000 people. In the 1980s, there was no bookshop in Newark-on-Trent. There was no cinema in Newark-on-Trent. We didn't have much culturally. You know, it was pretty much a wasteland. It's got better now, but there was nothing much. But what we did have from the early 80s onwards was this library right in the centre of town. And it's a beautiful library. It's a modern library. It's not in an old classic library building. It's almost like a giant greenhouse in the centre of Newark. And I was a latchkey kid because both my mum and dad worked. So my mum was a teacher. My dad commuted to London, and he'd arrived back super late. So I had about 3 hours every day before my mum came home, and I didn't used to always want to sort of go back to the house. So I'd go along to the library, which was about 5 minutes away from my house, and I'd just sit there and I'd read books. And at secondary school, I didn't always have a good time at school. I had a rough time, like a lot of kids, at the age of 11, 12, 13, because I'd gone from this tiny village school to this big, massive state comprehensive school. And I struggled to fit in for a couple of years. I eventually made some really good friends in some of the best years, but there was that early teenage period where, yeah, it wasn't good. And I hid the fact, stupidly, I hid the fact that I liked reading, because it wasn't really the cool thing for boys to do. You know, it's that stupid schoolyard mentality. You know, it's football and rugby, and that was it. And if you were sat on the bench reading a book, whatever book, then you were a weirdo or whatever. So I actually was like a secret reader for a little while. So I would go to the library in Newark and discover all kinds of different books. And up until that point, I'd sort of had a relationship with books that I felt like books were there almost like medicine. They're there to do me good, or, you know, like All Brand cereal to be something that you kind of have to take, but you don't necessarily want to. And that in that library, I discovered James Herbert, Stephen King, a great writer for teenagers called S.E. Hinton, who wrote The Outsiders. I discovered all these different writers. But sometimes I wouldn't even be reading. I'd just sit in the library. And I think libraries themselves, I didn't think it then, but since looking back, I think libraries themselves are so important, because if you think about it, they are one of the few spaces we have in our towns and cities that actually like us before they like our wallets. You know, okay, we have to give some money if we're late with our library fine, or, you know, to use this particular computers, but generally we can go in a library and we can just exist, and we can sort of peruse and look at it. And in that way, I suppose we've got libraries and we've got churches, and if you're a kind of secular person, you basically, your library becomes your church. And so that's what it was for me. It was just a space. It was a you know, I could actually absorb the day and process the day if I've had a crap day at school or whatever. So libraries were always important to me. Having said that, there was never a particular one librarian that I sort of formed a relationship with or got to know that well. If anything, the character of Mrs. Elm in the book is based on an old English teacher I had from school called Mrs. Kurzweil, who gave me a lot of confidence in my writing at a time when I didn't have much confidence. And also a bit of my nan in there too. My nan was a lovely woman, but, you know, it's very tough love. But she always seemed to know everything to my young brain. And so there's a bit of my nan as well.
Thank you. There's another wonderful quote about librarians in this case. Librarians have knowledge. They guide you to the right books, the right worlds. They find the best places, like soul-enhanced search engines. And I love that idea of soul-enhanced search engines, such a good term. You spoke a little bit about Mrs. Kurzweil, your English teacher, the fact that she gave you confidence with your writing at a time when you maybe lacked some of that. Can you tell us a bit about your journey to becoming a writer?
Yes, yeah, it's kind of a long, complicated one, but I'll give you, yeah, it's kind of dramatic as well, because basically, for those that don't know, at the age of 24, I had a full-blown breakdown. I was living in Spain, in Ibiza. I'd misread that Thoreau quote and had gone crazy, and had been working in Ibiza for 3 years with my girlfriend, who's now my wife. But by the third summer, we had reputable, almost boring jobs on the islands. I was a box office manager, and she was an office manager for this sort of hotel and nightclub place. And we were having quite a boring time. It wasn't lots of drugs and rock and roll. It was very tame this third year. And it was 2 weeks from going home. And it was in the morning. I used to drink and smoke back then, but I hadn't had a cigarette, hadn't had anything. It was 11 in the morning. I'd been for a run and come back, and I started having a panic attack. And the panic attack didn't end. You think of a panic attack as like a 10-minute thing. It was just, I was suddenly in this new reality of mental illness and depression. And I won't give you the whole story because it's sort of out there in the public domain, but I was very ill for a long time. I was suicidal for a long time. I had to go back to live with my parents. Me and Andrea had no money. We just had a lot of student debt. Eventually, we managed to get to Leeds to rent a flat, because I was sort of doing my parents' head in, rent a flat in Leeds. But I was very agoraphobic. I couldn't actually get a real job. My girlfriend at the time, was earning a little bit of money as a freelance PR person. But yeah, we were in a bit of a predicament because I couldn't do anything. And then this is the slightly longer version, but then as part of this PR company my wife was sort of setting up, I would write newsletters very boring newsletters about marketing and the internet. And this is back in the year 2000 now. So anyone could have been an expert on the internet then. So I was like this 24-year-old talking nonsense about the internet, and I think I was very good at it. And anyway, from out of the blue, this business publisher who published these sort of boring business textbooks said, you know, oh, we could turn this newsletter into a book. And, you know, it wasn't the big time or anything, but a published book happens out of those words. And, you know, I definitely don't advise anyone to read any of my business books that I wrote during that year. But for someone with agoraphobia and anxiety and depression, it actually gave me a bit of that confidence I was lacking, that I could actually function, that I could actually sort of earn some money, not much money, but I could work, do something. And it taught me a bit of discipline about writing in terms of meeting deadlines, research, work. And I kind of liked almost playing the role of being a top business person, because if you're writing a business book, even though you're not literally pretending to be a top business person, you kind of have to develop that voice where you're this sort of cocksure person. And that, when you're in the middle of sort of anxiety and stuff, it was almost quite a comforting act, I suppose. And then what happened is Andrea, my partner, I was starting to recover, but my partner's mum became ill with cancer, ovarian cancer, chemotherapy. She recovered eventually, but it was a very rough year. And we sort of gave up what we were doing in Leeds and moved to the northeast in County Durham. And in this tiny little modern house where we're all getting under each other's feet. And I had nothing to do all day apart from sit there and go mad. So I started writing a novel, and it was a very silly novel. It was called The Last Family in England, and it eventually got published. But it was probably one of the hardest ideas for a first novel to get published. It was told by a dog, by a Labrador, and it was a reworking of a quite obscure Shakespeare play, Henry IV, Part 1. And yeah, so I had loads and loads and loads of rejections. And then I found an agent, about the 50th agent, who was mad enough to take it on. And then it took another year for that to get published. And then I was in with the publisher and I got my foot in the door. And I wrote 2 more books with them. And then I was dropped. And then I wrote a book called The Radleys, which that publisher didn't want. And then I had to almost agent myself. And I found, luckily, this great independent publisher called Canongate Books, who their big success had been Life of Pi. And there was an editor there I'd had some contact with, and I just kept on, and they eventually gave me a break. And since then, over the last 10 years, it's been really nice, because I've almost had like an old-fashioned writer career where you start off small and you grow and grow. Because what happens too often now, as I'm sure you know, is a lot of writers will get like these massive advances for their first book, and there'll be so much pressure on my shoulders when it comes to the second book. And I was lucky that I didn't feel lucky at the time. I wanted the big book. But now I look back on it, I sort of managed to build up readers slowly. So it's been a long old ride. I think The Midnight Library is book number 20 or something crazy like that. And that's not even including those horrible rubbish business books either.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that kind of slower lead in and the ability to build your voice and grow your voice is so important, and sadly doesn't happen that often anymore. Thank you for your honesty about your mental health, and of course that led to Reasons to Stay Alive, which has been massively successful and has probably changed a huge number of people's lives. I wonder whether as a consequence of that, and you being something of a go-to now regarding mental health, is there ever something of a burden of responsibility with that?
Yeah, definitely. I used to struggle with it a lot. I mean, I've only really been open about my mental health for 5 years. I mean, Reasons to Stay Alive came out in 2015, and that was almost my coming out about my experience of depression and stuff. And even though I blabber on a lot online nowadays about mental health, I was actually very private about it for years. For over a decade, I didn't tell anyone beyond my parents or my partner about what I was going through. And so I lost a lot of friends along the way, really. And so it was quite a transition that suddenly, like, my biggest book to date, you know, at that time was Reasons to Stay Alive. So people just saw me as this mental health person. And they'd almost treat, even though I'm not a doctor or anything, they'd almost treat you like the Samaritan. So you'd get lots of emails from people who were quite ill and in a bad place. And some of them were the kind of emails you couldn't really ignore because they were vulnerable people. And I struggled with that side of it for a while because as soon as you write a book like Reasons to Stay Alive, people think you've got all the answers. And really, I don't have all the answers. I was just a person who went through an experience and got to a better place, but by no means was in a state of 100% wellness. So I'd be reading these emails and getting quite, you know, panicky and a bit triggered from reading all of these symptoms people were telling me about and things like that. So for a little while, there was a little point where I thought it was too much and I'd have pressed the button to not have written it and to have not had it out there. But now I'm much more accepting of it all, going back to self-acceptance. And I feel, I mean, I definitely don't think Reasons to Stay Alive is my best book by any means, but it's probably the book, if I had to pick one book of mine to be out there in the world, I think I'd have to pick that one because it has been of some practical use to people. You know, I get contacted even now in 2021 from people who it's apparently helped. And it is nice to feel like you've done something that was useful. Because when I wrote it, I thought I was writing for a very small readership of people who are in that exact situation, that exact suicidal situation. But what's been interesting has been most people who've read that book aren't people who are going through that. They are people who want to understand a relative or a partner or a child that they love or care about. And it's given them a kind of window onto what it's like. Because I think it's very frustrating to care for someone in the state I was in. You know, when you've got this invisible thing, you know, depression and anxiety and all those things, they're often not very visible. You know, I could have faked a smile. I was agoraphobic, but I could have actually still gone out and you wouldn't have necessarily seen my panic attack. I'd have just looked like a serious person. So I think that's been the nice thing, that it's opened up people's, you know, people who've come across it, they can actually see what someone's feeling like. Because when you're ill, and when I was ill, often it's very hard to articulate what you're actually feeling. And it can be very frustrating for people to think, well, you know, it's so tempting to just say, pull yourself together or whatever. And obviously it's not as simple as that.
Thank you. And it's really heartening reading some of the comments coming through where people are saying that it's helped them in terms of understanding themselves, but also helped them to better understand the people that they love and care about. We are rapidly coming to the point where I think we need to open up for questions. But before we do that, could I ask if you'd be willing to give us another short reading, please?
Yes. You know what, Jake? I was going to do that one, but you've read some of it, so I'm going to choose one a little bit before that. I think basically there's one of her lives she has where she goes to the Arctic and she's a glaciologist, and this is if she'd have pursued her sort of academic ambitions of science. I have it. Hold on. I do have it. I did have it. I've dog-eared it. Right. Okay. It's been a little while. I'm a bit rusty with the old readings. Right. This chapter, I do super short chapters, don't I? I do like that. So it's not a long chapter. I'll give you the whole chapter. This takes place after this incident with the polar bears happened on this island where she was. And she's shocked, but she also, something stirred inside her. She was in shock, but it was a slightly different kind of shock than the others on the dinghy assumed. It wasn't the shock of having been close to death. It was the shock of realizing she actually wanted to live. They passed a small island teeming with nature. Green lichens spread over rocks. Birds, little auks and puffins clustered together, huddled against the Arctic wind, life surviving against the odds. Nora sipped the coffee that Hugo handed her, fresh from his flask, holding it with cold hands even under 3 pairs of gloves. To be part of nature was to be part of the will to live. When you stay too long in a place, you forget just how big an expanse the world is. You get no sense of the length of the longitudes and latitudes. Just as, she supposed, it is hard to have a sense of the vastness inside any one person. But once you sense that vastness, once something reveals it, hope emerges, whether you want it to or not, and it clings to you as stubbornly as lichen clings to rock. So that's her turnaround moment where she starts to get a little bit of hope inside her. Anyway, there you go.
Thank you. That's a really nice point sort of to go into our next part of the session, which is questions from the audience. So the first question is from Andy, and he would like to ask you if you approach your writing by thinking of a story and the mental health messages come naturally, or whether you think of a message and then focus on a story around that.
That's really, really a good question, actually. And I don't know the exact answer, because I think it varies. When I realized the Midnight Library would be a good one to write was when I realized that actually the plot and the story and the theme were kind of the same thing. So the Midnight Library of the title is a plot device on one level, but it's also the theme. You know, it's the theme of regret and self-acceptance. It's all contained within the Midnight Library. So I think with this book, it was one of those rare cases where both the theme and the feeling of the book came at the same time as the story. I don't think that's always the case with me. I will say, though, that since my book, The Humans, I've actively tried to be an optimistic writer, partly because my very, very first few novels were quite bleak. I wrote one book called The Possession of Mr. Cave, and I wrote it when I was actually going through another bout of depression, a milder type of depression, but still depression. And it's not a bad book, so I don't want to put people off reading it, but I personally, I can't look at it. It's like looking at a really bad old photo of yourself, or a photo from a strange time in your life that you don't want to look at. And because I remember what I was feeling when I wrote it, but also it's so bleak. Like almost every character in that book ends up dead. And, this man goes mad. And at that point, and I was quite insecure as a writer then, and I felt that to be a serious writer, you kind of needed to reflect all the misery of life and all the sort of doom and gloom. And I think that I'd gone so far with that book that I thought after that, you know what, screw it. You know, if I'm actually if I'm arrogant enough to write a book and put it out in the world and expect people to read it, I want it to have something positive in it, something optimistic, but also try and be authentic. I don't mean authentic in realistic, because I write all kinds of fantasies and strange science fiction stuff, but I mean it to have some kind of authentic emotion to it. And I suppose in the Midnight Library, what I was determined to do was actually really acknowledge the bleakness of life, but try and find the light within it, you know, try and find something hopeful within the darkness. Because I know from my own experience that ends up being more nourishing than if it's all rainbows and unicorns from the get-go, and you kind of feel alienated from it. So I wanted to take this character who was literally at her lowest ebb, and then try and find a way to slowly conjure some hope inside her. But yeah, with this book, as I say, the story and theme, they were so intertwined. It's hard to say whether I got the plot before I got the sort of feeling of it. It kind of happened together. Good question, though.
Thank you. Yeah, and I agree. I think, there does feel to be a truth there. There's hope, but it's not sort of drifting with sentiment. So we've got a question from Steve here, and his daughter Molly, who is watching, hello Molly, would like to know what your approach to writing is on a daily basis, where you write and how long the book take to write. She's 13 and she's loving the Midnight Library.
Oh, thank you, Molly. Hi, both of you. Hi, Steve. Hi, Molly. It is Molly, isn't it? It's Molly and Steve, yeah. Basically, I don't really have a routine. I need to have more of a routine, because what happens with me is I go through long periods of floundering and sort of not writing much at all. And then when I get the idea and I get my groove on, I write, all day, Monday through Friday. I sometimes don't have weekends. I will say, though, that I get far more done in a morning. I'm very much a morning writer. For every paragraph I write before, say, 2 p.m, that'd be the equivalent of like 1 sentence after that. My brain sort of slows down in the afternoon. So a good day for me would be get up, have a run. I don't run every day, but for mental health reasons, I like to run and get up and then write and sit at my laptop for about a couple of hours writing. I'm at the frustrating part in the process at the moment where I'm obviously doing a lot of stuff still for the Midnight Library, although I wrote it a long time ago, and I'm starting a new novel, and it's sort of agonizing at the moment because I don't know quite which way I'm going with it. So I'm doing a lot of, like today I wrote no words today, so it was super frustrating. So it depends. I know other writers are different. I know I can think of a couple of thriller writers who plan everything out. They know it all before they start. Ian Rankin, he has like a whiteboard. He has like a flow chart. It's like, honestly, it's like amazing. I love to be like that. I love to have a flow chart, but I can't, and I don't write in consecutive order either. With the Midnight Library, the first chapter the reader reads is definitely not the first chapter I wrote. In fact, I think the first chapter is the last chapter I wrote. So very often I'll wait to the very end to write the first chapter, because then I feel like the first chapter is important, but you kind of have to know the book. To write the first chapter well, you kind of have to know the book, so it takes me that long. So a lot of the work I do is in the editing phase. It's very different to the first draft. To give you an idea of how different, the first draft of the Midnight Library, the main character wasn't Nora, it was a man. The main character was a man, and that changed for all kinds of reasons. I think because it was too close to me and I couldn't really see it properly. And I think by making it someone overtly not me, like a woman called Nora, then I could weirdly put more autobiographical stuff in that character because I wasn't writing myself, if that makes sense. But yeah, so basically I'm a morning person, but beyond that, I'm not great at routine.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Imogen, who's been reading the book with her mum, and she's loved it. And she was wondering if any of the characters were inspired by people who you know.
In the Midnight Library? Well, I mean, Nora, I suppose, as I've sort of hinted, has a lot of me. The first sort of 20 pages of the book, that was me putting a lot of my memories of that feeling of feeling very low into Nora. And some of her lives that she wishes for are lives I'd wished for. I used to play the piano. I gave up as a teenager because I was too self-conscious. I wish I hadn't. And one of her lives, she's a successful musician. So that was a bit of me. In terms of Mrs. Elm, she's like an amalgam, as I said, of my grandmother and Mrs. Kurzweil, the English teacher. Beyond that, not really. I mean, I suppose every character is either a version of yourself or an amalgam of people you've known. Her parents, though, they're not really, although they're never in the book, they're sort of there as a memory, and they're very different to my parents. I have a close, but in the past it's been occasionally problematic relationship with my sibling, which is similar to Nora, but the genders are reversed. Like I've got a sister and a brother, but you know, beyond that, it's only really Mrs. Elm and Nora which have the autobiographical elements to them.
Thank you. You mentioned Borges, and that kind of brings us on to a question that Jonathan is asking, which is what authors and or books inspire you?
All kinds. I mean, when I'm writing a novel, I read a lot of non-fiction. So I read a lot of non-fiction, whether that's just to research, whether it's like philosophy, like Henry David Thoreau. But yeah, I mean, I write quite a wide range of books because I like children's books and non-fiction. And I think my reading taste is even broader. So everything from Margaret Atwood, poetry, Emily Dickinson, I reference a lot. Emily Dickinson, I see like as a pencil sharpener for your brain. A lot of poets are like this, actually. If you're stuck with words and you don't have time to read an entire novel, sometimes if you just read an amazing poem, and I like a lot of old American poetry, like Emily Dickinson, her poems are so simple and so easy to read, yet every time you read them, you get something new out of them. I like writers that are sort of, they seem simple. They seem more simple than they are, but they pack so much power into sort of simple words. Who else is there? Stephen King, obviously I mentioned. S.E. Hinton, I think I've mentioned. But, you know, I've got great respect for Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh is one of my favorite books of all time. I actually think Winnie the Pooh is and The House at Pooh Corner, I think they are kind of self-help books in a way. And I actually read Winnie the Pooh when I was ill back at my parents' house when I was 24 years old, and it was on my sort of childhood bookcase. And I read it. It was one of the few things I could get through. And Winnie the Pooh, I honestly think it was almost because A.A. Milne had his own sort of issues, and he had a bit of PTSD from war and stuff. I think it was almost deliberately like a sort of kind of therapy, or whatever he would have thought of it at the time. Because, yeah, I mean, you've got Eeyore who's depressed, you've got Piglet who's anxious, you've got you've Tigger who's hyperactive, you've got all the different mental states in those characters. And yeah, so I'm a big fan of Winnie the Pooh as well. So all sorts.
That's fantastic. And yeah, we're really coming up to the close of the
that's
event.
back on so quick. I really like that.
It's gone.
I know we had that slight
quickly.
technical hitch at the start, but no, we did well there, didn't we?
Yeah.
And I'm reading the comments.
There are some lovely comments. And I think Winnie the Pooh is a really nice place to end, because it brings us back to another quote within the book. It's not what you look at that matters.
Yes, Rachel said The Tower of Pooh. That's just popped up. That's a great book. I only read that in lockdown. Another book I read in lockdown, which is brilliant, and I'll just mention, Jake, sorry, is a book called When Things Fall Apart, which is by, I'm not a Buddhist, but it's by a Buddhist author called Pema Chodron. And it is a bit about Buddhism, but it's generally about uncertainty in life and how you cope with things. And I found it really useful last year when, like everyone else, I was turning into a hypochondriac and had a million COVID worries and was phoning my mum all the time. And it's just a great book at reframing uncertainty. So that's been a big influence on me as well. I don't know why The Tower of Pooh made me think of that, but anyway, When Things Fall Apart, that's called. There you go. Sorry.
Brilliant.
Oh,
no.
Steve's just asked what Matt's favourite Stephen King is. Well, it's a weird one, actually, because I know he's written better books, but the one I've got most personal attachment to is a book called Christine, which was about a car which was possessed. And it's one of the sort of, you know, more, I don't know, cornier Stephen King horrors, but I read it at just the right age and I thought it was amazing. So I've always got a soft spot for Christine. There we go. Right.
Brilliant, thank you. I think you've added to all of our reading lists, which is a lovely way to end the event. Thank you so much, Matt, for a truly fascinating event. It's flown by, and thank you to everyone for joining us as part of this.
Yes, thanks, guys.
A big thank you too to Lancashire County Council's Library Service for partnering with us on the Big Read, and to Canongate and Matt for working with us on that. We very much hope that you'll take part in the Big Read. Copies of the Midnight Library are available to purchase from the Litfest bookshop, or are available for click and collect through libraries. And one quick final reminder, please, if you have enjoyed today's event, please do consider donating to Litfest in order that we can work on future projects and events. And I think after the challenges of the past year, we probably all need some good stories. So thank you very much once again to Matt. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you at some of our future events. Many thanks indeed.
Thanks, Bob. Bye.